What if I told you that Zambia's economic crisis was never fully in Zambian hands? That the fall of Edgar Lungu and the rise of Hakainde Hichilema might have been quietly orchestrated behind closed doors in Washington and IMF boardrooms? This isn't just a story about debt or development. It's a story of global influence, of how powerful financial institutions like the IMF and strategic political players from the US may have shaped Zambia's leadership transition. Was it really about helping Zambia or controlling it? And what role did Lungu's family and HH himself play in the quiet battle for Zambia's future? In this eye-opening exposé, we dive deep into what some are calling the IMF Trap, a web of debt, diplomacy, and quiet power that may have transformed Zambia's leadership forever. As former President Edgar Lungu faced mounting economic challenges, global institutions like the IMF and US foreign policy actors reportedly took a keen interest in Zambia's future. Then came Hakainde Hichilema's rise to power. Coincidence or consequence? Watch as we uncover how IMF loans shaped Zambia's political landscape, why the US may have preferred HH over Lungu, the role of foreign influence in Zambia's democracy, what this means for Africa's future leadership. Don't forget to subscribe to IMF Official for real political investigations across Africa. Stay with us. The truth behind this IMF trap will shock you. The IMF trap, fact or fiction? The notion of an IMF trap refers to the perception that the International Monetary Fund's lending programs, particularly in developing nations like Zambia, create cycles of debt dependency, economic austerity, and loss of national sovereignty. This section evaluates whether this trap is a tangible phenomenon or a misconception, drawing on Zambia's experience and broader African context. Historical context of IMF involvement. The IMF, established in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, aims to foster global monetary cooperation and financial stability. For African nations, IMF engagement often begins during economic crises, offering loans as a lender of last resort to stabilize balance of payments issues. However, these loans come with conditionalities, structural adjustment programs, SAPs, requiring reforms like austerity, privatization, and market liberalization. Critics argue these conditions prioritize creditor interests over local needs, trapping countries in debt cycles. In Zambia, the IMF's influence dates back to the 1970s, post-independence, when the country faced economic strain from falling copper prices. The SAPs of the 1980s and 1990s, implemented under the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy, MMD, led to privatization of state assets, including mines, which critics claim destroyed Zambia's industrial base. Public backlash against these reforms fueled skepticism toward the IMF, a sentiment that persisted into Edgar Lungu's presidency, 2015 to 2021. Fact: evidence of the IMF trap. Debt dependency. Zambia's external debt reached $12 billion by 2020, with a debt-to-GDP ratio near 120%, one of the highest in emerging markets. The IMF's extended credit facility, ECF loans, while providing temporary relief, often require austerity measures that limit public spending on health, education, and infrastructure, perpetuating economic stagnation. Loss of sovereignty. IMF conditionalities, such as cutting fuel subsidies and realigning expenditure, reduce a government's fiscal autonomy. During Lungu's tenure, resistance to these terms reflected fears of losing control over economic policy, a concern echoed across Africa. Neo-colonial dynamics. Critics, including Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, argue that IMF policies reinforce neo-colonial control by prioritizing Western creditor interests. For instance, African countries face higher borrowing costs and stricter conditions compared to Western nations like Germany in the 1950s, which benefited from lenient debt restructuring terms. Fiction. Counter-arguments. Economic stabilization. Proponents argue that IMF programs provide critical financial lifelines. Zambia's 2021 IMF talks, post-Lungu, aim to address the 2020 sovereign default, signaling market confidence and stabilizing the kwacha temporarily. Policy anchor. Economists like Irmgard Erasmus suggest that IMF guidance can restore fiscal credibility, as seen in Zambia's 2021 central bank rate hike to 8.5%, aligning with IMF recommendations. Local mismanagement. Some argue that the trap is exaggerated, with local governance issues like corruption and overspending being the primary drivers of economic crises. Lungu's administration, for instance, was criticized for extravagant expenditure, including $3.2 billion on a railway project with questionable viability. Zambia's experience. Zambia's economic woes under Lungu, culminating in the 2020 default, highlight both sides. The IMF's refusal to provide aid in 2016 due to Lungu's reluctance to implement austerity measures exacerbated fiscal strain, yet his administration's borrowing from China and Eurobond markets was equally unsustainable. The trap is thus partly factual, as IMF conditions limit policy freedom, but also a fiction when local mismanagement amplifies the crisis. Edgar Lungu's economic crisis explained. Edgar Lungu's presidency, 2015 to 2021, was marked by economic turmoil, culminating in Zambia's first pandemic-era sovereign default in 2020. This section dissects the causes, policies, and consequences of this crisis. Background. Lungu inherited a challenging economy from Michael Sata, with declining weakening copper prices, a key export, straining government revenues. His administration prioritized infrastructure development, funded by Chinese loans and Eurobonds, aiming to stimulate growth. However, these investments failed to deliver promised economic benefits, leading to a debt crisis. Key factors of the crisis. Debt accumulation. Zambia's external debt grew from $8.7 billion in 2015 to over $12 billion by 2020, driven by loans for infrastructure like roads and schools. Interest payments consumed 30 to 40% of revenues, leaving little for social services. Copper dependency. Zambia's economy, heavily reliant on copper, 70% of export earnings, suffered from global price slumps. The IMF projected a 0.6% GDP growth in 2021 after a 3.5% contraction in 2020. Corruption allegations. Reports from the Zambian Financial Intelligence Center, ZFIC, alleged that Lungu and his associates accumulated wealth through corrupt practices, including bribes from construction contracts. These claims, part of the Swazi Secrets leak, damaged investor confidence. IMF resistance. Lungu's refusal to accept IMF aid packages in 2015 and 2017 due to stringent conditions like cutting fuel subsidies, limited access to stabilizing funds but preserved short-term political capital. Authoritarian measures. Lungu's declaration of a threatened emergency in 2017 and the arrest of opposition leader Hakainde Hichilema on treason charges strained relations with Western donors, including the IMF, further isolating Zambia economically. Consequences. Sovereign default. In November 2020, Zambia defaulted on a $42.5 million Eurobond payment, signaling severe fiscal distress. Economic hardship. High inflation, near 20% in 2021, and unemployment fueled public discontent, contributing to Lungu's 2021 election loss. Political fallout. Corruption scandals and economic mismanagement eroded Lungu's Patriotic Front (PF) support, paving the way for Hichilema's landslide victory. Lungu's legacy. Lungu's infrastructure investments like roads and hospitals were praised by supporters, but critics argue they were unsustainable and poorly planned. His resistance to IMF reforms reflected a desire to maintain political control, but it deepened Zambia's economic woes, cementing a checkered legacy. The role of the IMF and US in Zambian politics. The IMF and the United States exert significant influence on Zambian politics through financial aid, diplomatic relations, and geopolitical strategies. This section examines their roles during Lungu's tenure and beyond. IMF influence. Economic leverage. The IMF's conditionalities shape fiscal policy. In 2015, Lungu rejected a $1 billion IMF package requiring austerity measures, fearing political backlash. This decision delayed stabilization but preserved short-term public support. Political influence. The IMF indirectly influences politics by demanding governance reforms. Lungu's authoritarian actions, like arresting Hichilema, led to strained IMF relations, with the fund withdrawing its resident representative in 2020. Post-Lungu engagement. Under Hichilema, Zambia secured an IMF deal in 2022, signaling a shift toward market-friendly policies. However, ongoing austerity requirements highlight the IMF's enduring control over economic decisions. U.S. influence. Diplomatic pressure. The U.S. criticized Lungu's government for democratic backsliding, particularly after Hichilema's 2017 arrest. In 2020, Lungu expelled the U.S. ambassador over comments on governance, straining bilateral ties. Economic interests. The U.S., through institutions like the IMF, where holds significant voting power, influences Zambia's economic policies. U.S. support for Hichilema's 2021 candidacy aligned with his pro-market stance, seen as favorable to Western investors. Geopolitical strategy. The U.S. views Zambia as a counterbalance to Chinese influence, given Lungu's reliance on Chinese loans. Hichilema's engagement with Western donors reflects a strategic pivot toward U.S. interests. Interplay of IMF and U.S. The IMF and U.S. often align in promoting market-oriented reforms. During Lungu's tenure, their pressure for austerity clashed with his populist policies, contributing to his isolation. Hichilema's openness to IMF reforms and U.S. diplomacy facilitated his rise, illustrating how global powers shape Zambian politics through economic leverage and diplomatic signaling. How HH rose to power amid global influence. Hakainde Hichilema's ascent to the presidency in 2021 was a culmination of domestic discontent and strategic global support. This section traces his journey and the role of international actors. Hichilema's background. A businessman and economist, Hichilema led the United Party for National Development (UPND) since 2006, contesting 5 presidential elections before 2021. Known as HH, he positioned himself as a market-friendly reformer, contrasting with Lungu's populist approach. Path to power. Persistent opposition. Hichilema's 6 electoral attempts built his resilience and visibility. Despite arrests, e.g. 2017 treason charges, and electoral disputes, he maintained support in Zambia's southwest and gained traction in Lungu's northeast strongholds in 2021. Economic crisis as catalyst. Lungu's economic mismanagement, high debt, inflation, and unemployment galvanized voters. Hichilema's promises to end corruption and restore economic stability resonated widely. Global support. Western donors, including the IMF and US, viewed Hichilema as a stabilizing force. His pro-market rhetoric aligned with their interests, contrasting with Lungu's Chinese partnerships. Post-election, Zambia's bonds rallied, reflecting investor confidence in Hichilema's IMF engagement. Youth and urban vote. Frustrated young and urban voters, hit hard by economic hardship, backed Hichilema, giving him a 1 million vote lead over Lungu, 59.38% versus 38.33%. Global influence. IMF. The IMF's refusal to bail out Lungu's government in 2016 and 2020 highlighted his economic failures, indirectly boosting Hichilema's campaign. Post-2021, the IMF's swift engagement with Hichilema signaled approval. US and Western allies. The US and other Western nations criticized Lungu's authoritarianism, implicitly supporting Hichilema. His victory was seen as a win for democratic renewal and Western economic interests. China's role. Lungu's reliance on Chinese loans alienated Western donors, creating an opening for Hichilema to court them. His balanced approach to China and the West post-election reflects strategic navigation of global powers. Challenges post-election. Hichilema faces the task of balancing IMF-mandated austerity with public expectations for jobs and services. His administration's early IMF deal 2022 and debt restructuring efforts signal global confidence but risk domestic unrest if austerity deepens hardship. What happened to the Lungu family? The Lungu family faced significant scrutiny and legal challenges post-2021, reflecting political vendettas and corruption allegations. This section details their fate. Post-presidency challenges. Corruption allegations. The Zambian government under Hichilema targeted Lungu's family with anti-corruption probes. In 2023, Lungu's son and daughter-in-law were arrested over $5 million in allegedly tainted assets. Edgar Lungu and a daughter faced charges over $2 million in properties deemed proceeds of crime. Asset seizures. The state seized 20 properties allegedly illegally obtained by the Lungu family, intensifying claims of a political witch hunt. Lungu and his Patriotic Front denounced these actions as persecution. Funeral controversy. Following Edgar Lungu's death in June 2025 from cardiac complications in South Africa, a dispute erupted over his funeral. Lungu's will specify that Hichilema should not attend, reflecting their bitter rivalry. The family opted for a private burial in South Africa, defying the government's push for a state funeral in Lusaka. A Pretoria High Court order delayed the burial, highlighting ongoing tensions. Political isolation. Lungu's attempt to re-enter politics in 2023 was thwarted by a constitutional court ruling barring him from running again, citing term limits. His family's influence waned as Hichilema consolidated power. Family's response. The Lungu family, led by Esther and daughter Tassila, a Chiwama MP, accused Hichilema's government of harassment, including claims of house arrest and travel bans during Lungu's lifetime. They maintained that Edgar's medical treatment delays in South Africa due to alleged government restrictions contributed to his death. Public and political reactions. Supporters. Lungu's base viewed the family's treatment as political vengeance, undermining national unity. Critics. Hichilema supporters argued that the family's legal troubles stemmed from legitimate anti-corruption efforts, given the scale of alleged graft under Lungu. International observers. South African and regional leaders like Cyril Ramaphosa expressed sympathy but avoided direct involvement, emphasizing respect for family wishes. The bigger picture. Is Africa really independent? The question of Africa's independence is central to understanding Zambia's challenges within a broader continental context. This section explores whether African nations, including Zambia, have achieved true sovereignty or remain tethered to global powers. Historical context. Post-colonial Africa gained political independence in the 1960s, but economic and political dependencies persisted. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah warned of neo-colonialism, where foreign powers maintain control through economic leverage rather than direct rule. Evidence of limited independence. Debt dependency. Africa's external debt reached $1.152 trillion by 2023, with annual debt service payments of $163 billion. IMF and World Bank loans, while stabilizing, impose conditions that limit policy autonomy. Resource exploitation. African nations, including Zambia, rely on raw material exports, e.g. copper, but lack control over pricing or processing, benefiting foreign corporations. Geopolitical rivalries. The US, China, and other powers compete for influence in Africa. Zambia's shift from Chinese loans under Lungu to Western-backed IMF deals under Hichilema reflects this tug-of-war. Political interference. IMF conditionalities and Western diplomatic pressure shape domestic policies. Lungu's fallout with the US and IMF contrasted with Hichilema's alignment, illustrating external influence on leadership transitions. Counterarguments. Sovereign choices. African governments choose to engage with the IMF or China, reflecting agency. Lungu's rejection of IMF aid in 2015 was a sovereign decision, albeit with economic costs. Regional initiatives. Institutions like the African Development Bank and BRICS Contingent Reserve Arrangement offer alternatives to Western dominance, suggesting a path toward greater autonomy. Local agency. diplomacy, leaders like Hichilema leveraged global partnerships to strengthen domestic economies, indicating strategic navigation rather than submission. Zambia as a case study. Zambia's experience, shifting from Chinese debt to IMF programs, mirrors Africa's broader struggle. While politically independent, economic reliance on foreign loans and resources limits sovereignty. True independence requires regional integration and institutions, as Nkrumah advocated, to reduce external dependency. Final thoughts and global reactions. Final thoughts. The IMF trap is a mix of fact and fiction, real in its debt and austerity burdens, but overstated when local mismanagement is ignored. Lungu's economic crisis stemmed from both external pressures and internal failures, with the IMF and US playing significant but not exclusive roles. Hichilema's rise reflects domestic demand for change amplified by global support, while the Lungu family's travails highlight the personal costs of political rivalry. Africa's independence remains incomplete, tethered to global economic systems, but strategic agency offers hope for greater autonomy. Global reactions. Africa. Leaders like South Africa's Ramaphosa and Kenya's Ruto expressed condolences for Lungu, emphasizing regional unity. Western nations. The US and IMF welcomed Hichilema's reforms, with bond markets rallying post-2021, signaling confidence in Zambia's new direction. China. Beijing remains silent on Lungu's death and Zambia's shift, reflecting its reduced influence under Hichilema. Public sentiment. Zambian mourners were divided, with some grieving Lungu's populist legacy and others supporting Hichilema's anti-corruption drive.